Thank you very much, Declan, and thank you for that warm welcome. It's great to be back in Bray after a long time absent, and I would like to congratulate Stephen, first of all, for organising such an incredibly large meeting. He seems to have attracted a greater number of people here than I got first preferences in my general election when I stood here in Bray. Maybe it's the subject and it's not the panel, but I think the debate so far and the information so far has been extremely useful and very thought-provoking. I thought Constantin was doing extraordinarily well and being very informative until he was explaining one of his rather obscure economics expressions, and he turned to Stephen and to me, and he turned to the panel, and he said, no, it's not actually a cure for baldness, hair restoration, which explains why I've been told never to actually go on a panel with him. But otherwise, I think this meeting is very useful. Now, unlike Stephen, I did vote. Like Stephen, I did vote today in the Dáil, and I did vote in favour of the bill that was going through. But I personally regard that as simply allowing it to go through to referendum. And I have to confess that I'm still not decided on which way to vote or to campaign on this particular treaty. I find it very, very difficult because I can't really predict what's going to happen if we vote no. It's easier, I think, to say what will happen if we vote yes. There are some certainties in the treaty which have been explained to us very well, and they will be imposed upon us. I'm not certain whether the frighteners which are being put on us about voting no are a reality or the truth, and whether we're stepping into an unknown which is too dangerous, or we're taking a courageous step, which is one we should take and have the confidence to take. And that's something I'll have to make up my mind about in the next few weeks. It's also something which I'll try and explain to you in the next 5 minutes, what I see as the kind of arguments for and against. Before I went to the Dáil chamber today, I was watching. I was on the net, and I saw that the U.S. Chamber of Commerce had a press conference today, and they made a very political statement and a very significant statement. The US Chamber of Commerce came down, had all their heavyweights out there, and they said, you must vote yes in the referendum for the fiscal treaty. Now, that's a very unusual thing for them to do. They're a very determined and very influential group because of who they represent. But for them to actually get so openly involved in an Irish political battle like this was something, I think, fairly significant and fairly unusual. And I find some of their arguments extremely convincing, and of course the negatives which they point out, again, very scary and very frightening. And what they were saying was this. They said that the world is looking at Ireland once again, and the world, particularly foreign investment, is looking at Ireland to vote yes. They do not want to see, and it's the perception, maybe more than the reality as it so often is, Ireland as an unstable country, out of step with Europe, rocking the boat, and a country which they would be reluctant to put money into. And they were saying this very definitely. And it is unusual. I'm a journalist, and I ring up the US Chamber of Commerce quite often, and I say, what do you think of this? And they always bat it away. They nearly always say, we don't want to get involved in this particular thing. They will tell you off the record various things, but they will not openly say, we're interfering in an Irish political football. That's what they were doing today. So it's quite obvious that those people who represent, I suppose, 100,000 jobs, huge amount of very important companies in this country, the most vibrant part of the economy, are worried. And they're worried that we'll vote no. And that to me is significant. I'm a great admirer of US investment. I'm a great admirer of all these companies like Google and Facebook and all the others. And I think they are absolutely an imperative for the economy here. And I went then into the chamber, though. And I was sitting down, and the chairman, the Caracol in the chamber, he said, I would like you, please all, to welcome a delegation in the gallery from Iceland. And they got a fantastic welcome. A fantastic welcome. Because we have an identification with Iceland. And I thought, there we are. You know, debating this treaty, and there's little Iceland, who's already coming through a crisis worse than ours in many ways, who defaulted on its debt, on its bank debt, who's got courage. There's certain parallels they don't have with us, admittedly. Much smaller country, different trade profile. But they've come through it. They've defaulted on the debt, which we haven't done yet, which may or may not do. And they are back in the global bond markets already borrowing money. And this was only 2 or 3 years ago. And I wondered, and I said, and I'm sure we should all say, is it really such a scary prospect that we should go out and say, no, we are not going to go in at the diktat of Germany and France? We are not going to go in and say, yes. Because one of the downsides of this whole procedure, and ever since the November IMF-EU deal was struck, was that our governments have been frightened. But they've also been, I think, to some extent, and I don't want to be, it sounds patronizing, incompetent. And Stephen touched upon it, I think, when he said, you know, there's a kind of competency deficit. Politicians don't understand what they're doing a lot of the time. They don't understand the economics of this. They are intimidated by the whole European apparatus when they get out there, and they want to be part of the club. And I do think there is a problem that Enda Kenny and to some extent Brian Cowen and other countries were hit by this so hard that they fell into the hands of their civil servants and a few, and very few, economists, and they took the easy road, which was to say, okay, we'll save the banks, but the people will pay. That was the policy, and that is still the policy. And the debt is the problem, not so much the deficit. Now that is something we've got to realize, we've got to acknowledge, but we've got to consider, and this is the big if. If we take the road of no, and Europe says, you're out on your own, can we face the consequences? Yes. Okay. That's the decision we have to take. Yes. It is exactly for that reason it's so important that we have meetings of this sort. It is. But so that people can tell us what to think rather than we tell you what to think. Because there's too much of that being going on by people who really don't understand what is happening. Now, I think there's a very important thing happening. And it's happening on Sunday, and it's happening on Sunday 2 weeks. And if we're voting on this treaty, we may be voting in a vacuum. Because there's a presidential election in France. And Mr. François Hollande, who's going to be elected, I think, probably, has said specifically, and it's so close to the Irish agenda that it's very interesting, that he wants to renegotiate the fiscal treaty if he gets elected, and he wants to renegotiate it specifically to include specific proposals for growth. That will drive the other Europeans bonkers if he does it. And I think it is welcome if he does it. Because this is really part of the Irish agenda. And I think there's an important issue here. And this is partly why I'm undecided, I think. If we were to go into a fiscal treaty and a tighter bind with Europe, there would be, I think, a very different atmosphere if Hollande was in there doing what he promises to do, which include looking for Eurobonds guaranteed by all the nations, which is part of the Irish agenda as well, than if Sarkozy is there in Merkel's pocket. If you had a strong France pushing an agenda which says yes to the fiscal treaty, but it's got to include growth because growth is so important to Ireland, perhaps, and I'm only saying perhaps, but it's an issue worth considering, perhaps we could then live with the treaty if there's a balance the other side. And I would suggest, because circumstances may change, that there is a case for holding your decision until you see the result of the general election, of the presidential election, in the second largest economy in Europe. It is significant, it's important. I think if Sarkozy is elected, the waters aren't going to be very warm for us in there, whatever happens. Because let there be no doubt that the treaty does tighten the control of Europe over our fiscal behavior, over our finances, over our taxes. And I've had real problems with European referendums in the past, specifically for that reason. Specifically because I fear that this fiscal treaty is the road to fiscal or tax harmonization. They kept this out of this treaty because they reckoned they couldn't live with it. But we are almost inexorably traveling down a Franco-German agenda, and particularly a French one when Sarkozy is there, which will lead a push towards harmonization. Now, it's all very well, and what will the consequences of that be? Everybody knows. 12.5% goes, and with the 12.5% rate goes, the multinationals take fright, and it won't matter what we do on the fiscal treaty, they'll be gone at dawn. That is the malign scenario. So I do think that we should look very carefully at the whole idea of allowing greater control on these issues from Europe. We have been, like Iceland, we've been a rogue nation. We have to admit that. The government, the developers, the bankers, and everybody else who was in control in this country let the place go completely and utterly mad. And as a rogue nation, we are regarded with a certain amount of disapproval or certain curiosity by our European neighbours. We have been a rogue. Our economy has behaved extremely badly. What has happened here is the nation has been run by developers, bankers, politicians, builders, and a few others, and regulators, which has brought us into disrepute throughout the world. And the people of this nation have had very, very little say in this. But where we are regarded overseas as is someone has got to be brought into line. And that is deeply regrettable. But those who are responsible for it are to be blamed for it. But we still have a large number of those people still in power in this country, and we still have the same attitudes prevailing, I can assure you, in government now as was prevailing under the last government as well. So let me just say this, and I want to stop now. I'm sorry, I've gone on. We have got to be, I think, and the principle we've got to establish and we've got to champion here is this. We are equals in Europe. We are not going there to sign this fiscal treaty at the behest or in obedience or in some sort of deference to others. That's what our leaders did. That's what they did when they get there. There was never any doubt that Enda Kenny and Michael Noonan were going to sign this treaty when it was coming up. There was nothing. We had virtually no input into it whatsoever. But we are equals, and we've got to behave as equals. And we've got to be a country which makes a decision with confidence, whichever way it is, and with self-confidence again. And I think that's the way you should look at it, and we should look at it. We should say yes, if we really believe that we can survive this while not sacrificing too much to the greater powers in Europe, which I deeply doubt. Or we can say no in the confidence, in the strict and the realistic confidence that we can go ahead and, like Iceland, we can on our own be back in the global markets without the help of Europe or anybody else. Thank you very much indeed.
We're still going to borrow 50 billion euros just to manage the budget deficit. And we're borrowing it from our children.
1.2% difference today for us physically now, materially in Ireland,